What would you do if you were framed for a crime you didn't commit, and the people who set you up had no idea who you really were? Imagine being a black man in America, minding your business, only to be targeted by white cops who think they can get away with anything. But what if the man they framed wasn't just an ordinary citizen? What if he was a CIA agent? And what if the truth exploded in court, leaving everyone stunned? This is the story of Marcus Johnson, a man who was about to turn the tables on corruption and racism in the most unexpected way. It all started on a quiet Tuesday evening in the small town of Willow Creek. Marcus, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a calm demeanor, was driving home from work. He had just moved to the town a few months ago, keeping a low profile as part of his undercover assignment with the CIA. His mission was simple: gather intel on a local drug ring that had ties to international cartels. But what Marcus didn't know was that his life was about to take a dramatic turn. As he drove down the dimly lit streets, he noticed flashing blue and red lights in his rearview mirror. A police car was signaling him to pull over. Marcus frowned. He hadn't been speeding, and his car was in perfect condition. He pulled over to the side of the road, rolled down his window, and waited. Two white officers approached his car. The taller one, Officer Bradshaw, shone a flashlight into Marcus's face. "License and registration," he barked. Marcus handed over the documents, his mind racing. He knew how these situations could escalate, especially for a black man in a town like Willow Creek. He stayed calm, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. "Step out of the car," the other officer, Officer Daniels, ordered. Marcus complied, stepping out slowly. "Is there a problem, officers?" he asked, his voice steady. "We received a tip about a drug deal happening in this area," Bradshaw said, his eyes narrowing. "Your car matches the description." Marcus's heart sank. He knew this was a setup. He had no drugs on him, and his car was clean. But before he could say anything, Daniels was already searching his vehicle. Moments later, the officer held up a small bag of white powder. "Look what we have here," Daniels said with a smirk. "Cocaine." Marcus's eyes widened. "That's not mine," he said firmly. "You planted that." Bradshaw stepped closer, his face inches from Marcus's. "You're under arrest for possession of illegal drugs," he said, ignoring Marcus's protest. "You have the right to remain silent." As the officers handcuffed him and shoved him into the back of the patrol car, Marcus's mind raced. He knew he was being framed, but he also knew he couldn't reveal his true identity, not yet. He had to play along, at least for now. The next few hours were a blur. Marcus was booked, fingerprinted, and thrown into a holding cell. He sat on the cold, hard bench, his mind working overtime. He needed a plan. He couldn't let these corrupt cops get away with this. But more importantly, he couldn't blow his cover. His mission was too important. The following morning, Marcus was brought before a judge for his arraignment. The courtroom was packed with curious onlookers, including a few reporters. Marcus stood tall, his expression unreadable. The prosecutor, a smug-looking man in his mid-40s, presented the case against him, emphasizing the evidence found in his car. Marcus's court-appointed lawyer, a young woman named Sarah, tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, but the judge wasn't having it. "Bail is set at $100,000, the judge declared, banging his gavel. As Marcus was led out of the courtroom, he caught a glimpse of Officers Bradshaw and Daniels smirking in the back row. They thought they had one. They thought they had successfully framed another black man and gotten away with it. But Marcus knew something they didn't. He wasn't just any black man. He was a CIA agent, and he was about to turn the tables on them in a way they could never have imagined. As he was being escorted back to his cell, Marcus's mind was already working on his next move. He had to get a message to his handler, but he had to do it without arousing suspicion. He knew the truth would come out eventually, but he had to be careful. One wrong move, and his cover would be blown, and his mission would be compromised. But Marcus wasn't the only one with a plan. As he sat in his cell that night, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. It was one of the guards, a man Marcus had never seen before. The guard looked around nervously before speaking in a low voice. "Marcus Johnson?" he asked. Marcus nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Who's asking?" The guard stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm with the CIA. Your handler sent me." We know what's going on, and we're going to get you out of here. But you need to trust me. Marcus's heart raced. This could be his way out, but it could also be a trap. He had to be careful. He nodded slowly, his mind racing with possibilities. As the guard left, Marcus sat back on his bunk, his mind spinning. He knew the next few days would be critical. He had to stay sharp, stay focused. The truth was about to explode, and when it did, it would change everything. But for now, Marcus had to wait. He had to play the game, just a little while longer. Because when the time was right, he would strike, and the world would see the truth. And that truth would be explosive. What will happen next? Will Marcus be able to prove his innocence? Will the corrupt cops get away with their crimes, or will the truth finally come to light? Stay tuned as the story and the truth begins to unravel. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more gripping stories like this one. The guard's words echoed in Marcus's mind as he lay on the thin, uncomfortable mattress in his cell. "We're going to get you out of here," the man had said. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Why would the CIA send a guard to deliver a message? Why not contact him through a more secure channel? Marcus knew better than to trust blindly. In his line of work, one wrong move could mean the difference between life and death. The next morning, Marcus was roused from his restless sleep by the sound of keys jangling outside his cell. The doors swung open, and the same guard from the night before stood there, his face unreadable. "Let's go," the guard said curtly. Marcus stood slowly, his muscles stiff from the cold, hard bunk. He followed the guard down the narrow hallway, his mind racing. Where were they taking him? Was this part of the plan, or was he walking into a trap? The guard led him to a small interrogation room where two men in suits were waiting. They looked official, but Marcus didn't recognize them. One of the men gestured for Marcus to sit, while the other stood by the door, his arms crossed. "Marcus Johnson," the first man said, flipping open a folder. "We've been reviewing your case. It seems there's more to you than meets the eye." Marcus remained silent, his expression neutral. He knew better than to speak without knowing who he was dealing with. The man leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "We know you're not just some random guy. You're CIA, aren't you?" Marcus's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't let it show. He kept his face blank, his eyes locked on the man's. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said calmly. The man smirked, leaning back in his chair. "You can drop the act, Johnson. We've got eyes everywhere. We know who you are, and we know why you're here." Marcus's mind raced. If these men really were with the CIA, why were they confronting him like this? And if they weren't, who were they? He had to tread carefully. "If you know who I am," Marcus said slowly, "then you know I'm not the one you should be worried about." The man's smirk faded, replaced by a look of irritation. "Listen, Johnson, we're trying to help you here. But if you don't cooperate, things are going to get a lot worse for you." Marcus leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "I don't know who you are or what you want, but if you're really here to help, then prove it. Get me out of here." The man exchanged a glance with his partner, then stood abruptly. "We'll be in touch," he said, before turning and leaving the room. Marcus was left alone with the guard, who gestured for him to stand. "Back to your cell," the guard said, his tone indifferent. As Marcus was led back to his cell, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Who were those men? Were they really with the CIA? Or were they part of something else? And more importantly, how was he going to get out of this mess? The next few days passed in a blur. Marcus was kept in isolation, with no contact with the outside world. He spent his time pacing the small cell, trying to piece together what was happening. He knew he had to find a way to communicate with his handler, but without access to a phone or computer, it seemed impossible. Then, on the third day, something unexpected happened. Marcus was brought to the prison's visitation room, where he was surprised to see Sarah, his court-appointed lawyer, waiting for him. "Marcus," Sarah said, her voice filled with concern. "Are you okay? I've been trying to get in to see you, but they wouldn't let me." Marcus nodded, sitting down across from her. "I'm fine," he said, though he knew he was far from it. "What's going on out there?" Sarah leaned in, lowering her voice. "I've been doing some digging," she said, "and I think I found something. The officers who arrested you, Bradshaw and Daniels, They have a history of misconduct. There are reports of them planting evidence, falsifying reports, even using excessive force. But every time, the charges against them get dropped. Marcus's eyes narrowed. So they've done this before. Sarah nodded. And I think they're doing it again. But this time, we might have a chance to stop them. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. If Sarah could prove that Bradshaw and Daniels had a history of misconduct, it could help his case. But he knew it wouldn't be enough. He needed more. He needed to expose the truth. Sarah, Marcus said, his voice low. I need you to do something for me. Sarah's eyes widened. What is it? Marcus hesitated. He knew he was taking a risk by trusting her, but he didn't have much of a choice. I need you to get a message to someone for me. It's important. Sarah nodded, her expression serious. Okay, what's the message? Marcus leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. Tell them Marcus Johnson needs extraction. Code Black. Sarah's eyes widened, but she didn't ask any questions. She simply nodded. I'll do it. As Marcus was led back to his cell, he felt a glimmer of hope. If Sarah could get the message to his handler, he might have a chance. But he also knew that time was running out. The longer he stayed in prison, the more danger he was in. That night, as Marcus lay on his bunk, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching his cell. He sat up, his heart pounding. The door creaked open, and the same guard from before stepped inside. It's time, the guard said, his voice low. Marcus stood, his mind racing. Time for what? The guard didn't answer. Instead, he gestured for Marcus to follow him. Marcus hesitated for a moment, then stepped out of the cell. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew he had to be ready for anything. The guard led him down a series of dark, narrow hallways until they reached a door marked Exit. The guard pushed the door open, revealing a dark alley outside. Go, the guard said, his voice urgent. And don't look back. Marcus didn't need to be told twice. He stepped out into the alley, the cold night air hitting his face. He took a deep breath, then started running. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he had to get as far away from the prison as possible. As he ran, he heard the sound of sirens in the distance. He knew it wouldn't be long before they realized he was gone. He had to find a safe place and fast. But just as he turned a corner, he was suddenly blinded by a bright light. He shielded his eyes, trying to see what was happening. Then he heard a voice, loud and commanding. Freeze. Put your hands in the air. Marcus's heart sank. He had been caught. But as his eyes adjusted to the light, he realized it wasn't the police. It was a group of men in black tactical gear, their weapons trained on him. One of the men stepped forward, lowering his weapon. Marcus Johnson? He asked. Marcus nodded, his heart still racing. The man extended a hand. We're here to get you out. Let's go. Marcus hesitated for a moment, then took the man's hand. He didn't know who they were, but he knew he didn't have much of a choice. He had to trust them. As they led him to a waiting van, Marcus couldn't help but wonder what was going to happen next. He had escaped from prison, but he was far from safe. The truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. And Marcus knew that when it finally came out, it would change everything. The van sped through the dark, empty streets, the city lights blurring past the windows. Marcus sat in the back, flanked by two of the men in tactical gear. No one spoke, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus's mind was racing. Who were these men? Were they really here to help him? Or was this another layer of the trap he seemed to be caught in? One of the men, the one who had identified himself as Agent Harris, finally broke the silence. We've been tracking you for days, Johnson, he said, his voice calm but firm. Your handler sent us. We're here to extract you and get you to safety. Marcus studied the man's face, searching for any sign of deception. Prove it, he said, his voice steady. What's the code? Harris didn't hesitate. Code Black. Extraction Protocol Delta 7. Marcus relaxed slightly. The code was correct. These men were legit. But that didn't mean he was out of the woods yet. Where are we going? He asked. Safe house, Harris replied. We'll debrief you there. For now, just sit tight. Marcus nodded, leaning back in his seat. He knew better than to ask too many questions. In his line of work, Information was given on a need-to-know basis. And right now, all he needed to know was that he was safe for the moment. The van pulled into an underground garage, the doors closing behind them with a heavy thud. The men quickly ushered Marcus out of the vehicle and into a nearby elevator. They rode up to the top floor of what appeared to be an abandoned office building. The safe house was sparse but functional, with a few chairs, a table, and a bank of computers lining one wall. Harris gestured for Marcus to sit. "We don't have much time," he said. "The local PD is already looking for you. We need to get you out of the city." Marcus frowned. "What about my mission? The drug ring I was investigating. They're still out there." Harris shook his head. "Your cover's blown, Johnson. The mission's over. Right now, our priority is keeping you alive." Marcus clenched his fists, frustration bubbling up inside him. He had been so close to uncovering the truth about the drug ring, and now it was all slipping through his fingers. But he knew Harris was right. If the police were after him, he couldn't stay here. "What about the cops who framed me?" Marcus asked. "Bradshaw and Daniels. They can't just get away with this." Harris's expression darkened. "We're working on that," he said. "But right now, we need to focus on getting you out of here. Once you're safe, we'll deal with them." Marcus nodded, though he wasn't entirely satisfied. He wanted justice, not just for himself, but for all the other innocent people Bradshaw and Daniels had likely framed over the years. But he knew he had to trust the process. For now, at least. The next few hours passed in a blur. Marcus was given a change of clothes and a fake ID, along with a new phone and a wad of cash. Harris and his team went over the extraction plan with him, detailing every step of the journey to the safe house in a neighboring state. Marcus listened carefully, committing every detail to memory. As dawn approached, Harris handed Marcus a small earpiece. "This is your lifeline," he said. "We'll be in constant contact. If anything goes wrong, we'll guide you through it." Marcus nodded, slipping the earpiece into his ear. He was ready, or as ready as he could be, given the circumstances. The team moved quickly, escorting Marcus back down to the garage and into a nondescript sedan. Harris took the wheel, while another agent sat in the passenger seat. Marcus sat in the back, his eyes scanning the streets as they drove. The city was just starting to wake up, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the clouds. Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. This time, he wasn't just fighting for his mission, he was fighting for his life. As they approached the city limits, Harris's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression tightening. "We've got a problem," he said, his voice grim. "The police have set up roadblocks on all major exits. They're looking for you." Marcus's heart sank. "What's the plan?" Harris didn't answer right away. He pulled over to the side of the road, his mind racing. "We'll have to take the back roads," he said finally. "It's riskier, but it's our only option." Marcus nodded, though he didn't like the sound of it. Back roads meant less traffic, but it also meant fewer places to hide if things went south. The sedan turned onto a narrow, winding road, the trees closing in around them. Marcus kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, watching for any signs of pursuit. So far, so good. But then, just as they rounded a sharp curve, Marcus saw it. A police cruiser, parked sideways across the road, blocking their path. Two officers stood beside the car, their weapons drawn. Harris cursed under his breath. "Hold on," he said, gripping the wheel tightly. The sedan screeched to a halt, the tires kicking up dust. The officers approached cautiously, their guns trained on the car. "Step out of the vehicle with your hands up," one of the officers shouted. Harris exchanged a glance with Marcus. "We've got no choice," he said quietly. "Play along." Marcus nodded, his heart pounding. He stepped out of the car, his hands raised. The officers moved in, their eyes narrowing as they recognized him. Well, one of the officers said with a smirk. "Look who we've got here. Marcus Johnson in the flesh." Marcus didn't respond. He kept his eyes forward, his mind racing. He had to stay calm. He had to think. The officers moved to handcuff him, but before they could, Harris stepped forward. "This man is in federal custody," he said, his voice firm. "You have no jurisdiction here." The officers hesitated, glancing at each other. "We don't care who you are," one of them said. "This man is a fugitive, and we're taking him in." Harris's hand moved to his holster, but before he could draw his weapon, one of the officers fired a shot. The bullet hit Harris in the shoulder, sending him stumbling back. Marcus reacted instantly. He lunged at the nearest officer, disarming him with a swift move. The other officer fired again, but Marcus dodged the bullet, tackling him to the ground. The fight was over in seconds. Marcus stood over the two unconscious officers, his chest heaving. He turned to Harris, who was clutching his shoulder, blood seeping through his fingers. "We need to move," Marcus said, helping Harris to his feet. "Now." Harris nodded, wincing in pain. "The car's still drivable," he said. "Let's go." They climbed back into the sedan, Marcus taking the wheel this time. He hit the gas, the car speeding down the road. Behind them, the sound of sirens grew louder. Marcus's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He had just attacked two police officers. There was no going back now. He was officially a fugitive. But as he drove, a strange sense of determination settled over him. He wasn't going to let them win. Not Bradshaw and Daniels. Not the corrupt system that had tried to destroy him. He was going to fight back. And he was going to expose the truth, no matter what it took. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but Marcus knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. The sedan roared down the back roads, the sound of sirens fading into the distance. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. Beside him, Harris was slumped in the passenger seat, his face pale and his breathing shallow. Blood soaked through the makeshift bandage Marcus had fashioned from a piece of his shirt. "Hang in there, Harris," Marcus said, his voice tense. "We're almost to the safe house." Harris groaned, his eyes fluttering open. You need to go without me," he muttered. "I'll only slow you down." Marcus shook his head. "Not happening. We're in this together." Harris tried to protest, but his words were cut off by a fit of coughing. Marcus glanced at him, his concern growing. They needed to get Harris medical attention, and fast. The safe house was just a few miles away, but every second felt like an eternity. Marcus's mind raced as he drove, trying to piece together a plan. He knew the police would be looking for them, and it wouldn't be long before they closed in. He had to stay one step ahead. Finally, the safe house came into view, a small, unassuming cabin tucked away in the woods. Marcus pulled up to the front, killing the engine. He quickly got out and helped Harris to his feet, half carrying him to the door. Inside, the cabin was sparsely furnished but equipped with everything they needed. Marcus laid Harris down on the couch, then rummaged through a nearby cabinet for a first aid kit. He worked quickly, cleaning and bandaging Harris's wound as best he could. "You're lucky," Marcus said, trying to lighten the mood. "The bullet went straight through. You'll live." Harris managed a weak smile. "Lucky me." Once Harris was stable, Marcus took a moment to assess their situation. The safe house was stocked with food, water, and weapons, but it wouldn't be safe for long. The police would eventually track them here, and they needed to be gone before that happened. Marcus grabbed a map from the table and spread it out, studying the surrounding area. There was a small town about 10 miles away, where they could hopefully find a doctor for Harris. Beyond that, there was a network of back roads that could take them to the next state. "We'll rest here for a few hours," Marcus said, looking at Harris. "Then we'll move out at nightfall." Harris nodded, his eyes already closing. "Sounds like a plan." Marcus sat down in a chair, his mind still racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The police weren't the only ones looking for him. He was sure of it. The drug ring he had been investigating had powerful connections, and they wouldn't take kindly to someone poking around in their business. As the hours passed, Marcus kept watch, his senses on high alert. The cabin was quiet, the only sound the occasional rustle of leaves outside. But then, just as the sun was beginning to set, Marcus heard it, the faint sound of an engine in the distance. He moved to the window, peering out through the curtains. A black SUV was approaching the cabin, moving slowly and deliberately. Marcus's heart sank. They had been found. "Harris," Marcus said, his voice low. "We've got company." Harris stirred, his eyes snapping open. "How many?" "At least one vehicle," Marcus replied. Could be more. Harris struggled to sit up, his face pale but determined. We need to move. Now. Marcus nodded, grabbing a bag and stuffing it with supplies. He helped Harris to his feet, then handed him a pistol. Stay close to me, he said. We're getting out of here. They moved to the back of the cabin, where a hidden door led to a tunnel beneath the house. Marcus had discovered it earlier while searching the cabin, and now it was their only hope of escape. The tunnel was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of earth. Marcus led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Harris followed close behind, his breathing labored but steady. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged from the tunnel into the woods. The SUV was still parked in front of the cabin, its occupants no doubt searching the building. Marcus and Harris moved quickly and quietly, putting as much distance between themselves and the cabin as possible. They reached a small stream, where Marcus stopped to catch his breath. We'll follow the water, he said. It'll throw off any dogs they might have. Harris nodded, leaning against a tree for support. You're full of surprises, Johnson. Marcus managed a small smile. You're not so bad yourself, Harris. They continued along the stream, the sound of the water masking their footsteps. The woods were dense, the trees providing ample cover. But Marcus knew they couldn't stay here forever. They needed to find shelter, and soon. As they walked, Marcus's mind kept returning to the drug ring. He had been so close to uncovering the truth, and now it felt like it was slipping further and further away. But he couldn't give up. Not now. Not when so much was at stake. Finally, they reached a small clearing, where an old, abandoned barn stood. It was dilapidated, but it would provide some shelter for the night. Marcus helped Harris inside, then set about making a fire. As the flames flickered to life, Marcus sat back, his mind still racing. He knew the road ahead would be long and dangerous, but he was ready. He had been through too much to give up now. Harris looked at him, his expression serious. What's the plan, Johnson? Marcus took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the fire. We expose the truth, he said. No matter what it takes. Harris nodded, a grim smile on his face. I'm with you. As the night wore on, Marcus and Harris sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows on the walls of the barn. Outside, the woods were quiet, the only sound the occasional hoot of an owl. But Marcus knew the quiet wouldn't last. The storm was coming, and when it did, he would be ready. The first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the barn's weathered walls, casting a soft glow over Marcus and Harris. The fire had burned down to embers, and the air was chilly, but Marcus felt a renewed sense of determination. They had survived the night, but the danger was far from over. Harris was still weak, his face pale and his movements slow, but he was alive. Marcus knew they couldn't stay in the barn much longer. They needed to keep moving, to put as much distance between themselves and their pursuers as possible. How are you holding up? Marcus asked, crouching beside Harris. Harris managed a weak smile. I've been better, he said, his voice hoarse. But I'll live. What's the plan? Marcus unfolded the map he had taken from the safe house, spreading it out on the ground. We're here, he said, pointing to a spot in the woods. The nearest town is about 10 miles east. If we can make it there, we might be able to find a doctor for you. Harris nodded, his eyes narrowing as he studied the map. And after that? Marcus hesitated. After that, we figure out how to expose Bradshaw and Daniels. But first, we need to get you patched up. Harris sighed, leaning back against the wall. You're a stubborn one, Johnson. I like that. Marcus smirked. You're not so bad yourself, Harris. They packed up their few supplies and set out, moving cautiously through the woods. The trees were thick, providing ample cover, but Marcus knew they couldn't afford to let their guard down. The police, and whoever else was after them, wouldn't give up easily. As they walked, Marcus's mind kept returning to the drug ring. He had been so close to uncovering the truth, and now it felt like it was slipping further and further away. But he couldn't give up. Not now. Not when so much was at stake. After several hours of walking, they finally reached the edge of the woods. The town was just ahead, a small, sleepy place that looked like it hadn't changed in decades. Marcus scanned the area, looking for any signs of danger. "We'll stick to the outskirts," he said, keeping his voice low. "There's a clinic on the other side of town. We'll head there." Harris nodded, his face pale but determined. "Lead the way." They moved quickly and quietly, sticking to the shadows as they made their way through the town. The streets were mostly empty, the few people they did see paying them no mind. Marcus kept his hand on his gun, just in case. Finally, they reached the clinic, a small, unassuming building with a faded sign out front. Marcus helped Harris inside, where a nurse immediately rushed over. "What happened?" she asked, her eyes wide with concern. "He was shot," Marcus said, keeping his voice calm. "He needs medical attention." The nurse nodded, quickly leading them to an exam room. Marcus stayed close, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of trouble. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not even here. As the doctor worked on Harris, Marcus stepped outside to get some air. The town was quiet, the only sound the distant chirping of birds. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He pulled out his phone, checking for any messages from his handler. There was nothing. He sighed, slipping the phone back into his pocket. He was on his own, at least for now. After what felt like an eternity, the doctor emerged from the exam room. "He's stable," he said, his voice calm but serious. "But he needs rest. He's lost a lot of blood." Marcus nodded, relief washing over him. "Thank you," he said. "We'll be out of your hair as soon as possible." The doctor hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "You're not from around here, are you?" Marcus shook his head. "Just passing through." The doctor studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Be careful," he said. "There's been talk of strangers in the area. People asking questions." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of questions?" The doctor shrugged. "Just be careful." Marcus nodded, his mind racing. He knew they couldn't stay here much longer. They needed to keep moving. He went back inside, where Harris was sitting up on the exam table, looking a little better. "How are you feeling?" Marcus asked. Harris managed a weak smile. "Like I've been shot. But I'll live." Marcus nodded. "We need to move." The doctor said there's been talk of strangers in the area. "We can't stay here." Harris sighed, but he didn't argue. Where to next? Marcus unfolded the map again, studying it carefully. "There's a safe house about 20 miles from here. We'll head there." Harris nodded, his expression grim. "Let's go." They left the clinic, moving quickly and quietly through the town. Marcus kept his hand on his gun, his senses on high alert. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As they reached the edge of town, Marcus heard it, the faint sound of an engine in the distance. He turned, his heart sinking as he saw a black SUV approaching. "We've got company," Marcus said, his voice low. Harris cursed under his breath. "What's the plan?" Marcus scanned the area, his mind racing. "This way," he said, leading Harris down a narrow alley. They moved quickly, sticking to the shadows as they made their way through the town. The SUV was close behind, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Finally, they reached the edge of town, where the woods began. Marcus and Harris plunged into the trees, the sound of the SUV fading behind them. They ran for what felt like hours, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally, Marcus stopped, leaning against a tree to catch his breath. We need to keep moving," Harris said, his voice strained. Marcus nodded, his heart pounding. "We'll rest for a few minutes. Then we'll keep going." As they sat in the darkness, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. The road ahead was long and dangerous, and he knew they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. But he also knew they couldn't give up. Not now. Not when so much was at stake. The woods were eerily quiet as Marcus and Harris caught their breath, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. Marcus's heart was still pounding, his senses on high alert. The black SUV had stopped at the edge of the woods, its occupants no doubt debating whether to follow them into the trees. Marcus knew they couldn't stay here for long. They had to keep moving. "We need to find cover," Marcus said, his voice low. "Somewhere they can't track us." Harris nodded, his face pale but determined. "There's an old ranger station about a mile from here," he said, pointing to a spot on the map. "If we can make it there, we might be able to lose them." Marcus studied the map, his mind racing. The ranger station was their best bet, but getting there wouldn't be easy. The woods were dense, and Harris was still weak from his injury. But they didn't have a choice. "Let's move," Marcus said, helping Harris to his feet. They set off through the trees, moving as quickly and quietly as they could. Marcus kept his hand on his gun, his eyes scanning the shadows for any signs of movement. The woods were alive with the sounds of nature, but Marcus knew that danger could be lurking anywhere. After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached the ranger station, a small, dilapidated building tucked away in the trees. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung crookedly on its hinges. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. Marcus pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly. Inside, the station was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of decay. But it was shelter, and that was all they needed. "We'll rest here for a while," Marcus said, helping Harris sit down on a dusty cot. "But we can't stay long. They'll be looking for us." Harris nodded, his breathing labored. "We need a plan," he said. "We can't keep running forever." Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. He knew Harris was right. They couldn't keep running. They needed to fight back. But how? As he paced the small room, Marcus's mind kept returning to the drug ring. He had been so close to uncovering the truth, and now it felt like it was slipping further and further away. But he couldn't give up. Not now. Not when so much was at stake. "We need to expose Bradshaw and Daniels," Marcus said, his voice firm. "If we can prove they're corrupt, it'll blow the whole thing wide open." Harris nodded, his expression grim. "But how? We're fugitives, remember? No one's going to believe us." Marcus frowned, his mind racing. He knew Harris was right. They needed evidence, something concrete that would prove their case. But where could they find it? Then it hit him. "The police station," he said, his eyes lighting up. "If Bradshaw and Daniels are dirty, there's got to be something there. Records, files, something." Harris's eyes widened. "You're talking about breaking into a police station? That's suicide." Marcus shook his head. "Not if we're careful. We'll go in at night, when there's less chance of being seen. We'll find what we need and get out." Harris hesitated, then nodded. "It's risky, but it might be our only shot." Marcus nodded, a sense of determination settling over him. They had a plan. Now they just had to execute it. They spent the next few hours resting and preparing. Marcus cleaned and reloaded his gun, while Harris tried to regain his strength. As the sun began to set, they set out for the town, moving cautiously through the woods. The town was quiet when they reached it, the streets empty and the lights dim. Marcus and Harris stuck to the shadows, making their way to the police station. It was a small building, with only a few cars parked outside. "Looks like there's only a skeleton crew," Marcus whispered, his eyes scanning the building. "We'll go in through the back." They moved around to the rear of the building, where a door led to a small storage room. Marcus picked the lock with ease, and they slipped inside. The station was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Marcus and Harris moved quickly and quietly, searching for anything that could help them. Finally, they found what they were looking for, a file room. Marcus flipped through the files, his heart racing as he found what he was looking for. Records of arrests, evidence logs, and, most importantly, a file on Bradshaw and Daniels. "This is it," Marcus said, his voice low. "This is what we need." Harris nodded, his eyes wide with excitement. "Let's get out of here." They grabbed the files and made their way back to the storage room. But just as they were about to leave, they heard it, the sound of footsteps approaching. Marcus's heart sank. They were trapped. "What do we do?" Harris whispered, his voice tense. Marcus thought quickly. "We fight," he said, his voice firm. "We've come too far to give up now." The door burst open, and two officers stepped inside, their guns drawn. But before they could react, Marcus and Harris were on them, disarming them with swift, precise moves. The fight was over in seconds. Marcus and Harris stood over the unconscious officers, their chests heaving. "We need to move," Marcus said, his voice urgent. "Now." They grabbed the files and ran, slipping out the back door and into the night. The town was still quiet, the streets empty. But Marcus knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. As they reached the edge of town, Marcus turned to Harris. "We did it," he said, a sense of triumph in his voice. "We've got what we need." Harris nodded, a grim smile on his face. "Now we just have to make sure the truth gets out." Marcus nodded, his mind racing. They had the evidence, but they still had a long way to go. The road ahead would be dangerous, but Marcus knew they couldn't give up. Not now. Not when they were so close. As they disappeared into the woods, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. They had taken the first step. Now they just had to keep going. The woods were alive with the sounds of the night. Crickets chirping, leaves rustling, and the occasional hoot of an owl. Marcus and Harris moved quickly and quietly, the stolen files tucked securely under Marcus's arm. Their hearts were still racing from the close call at the police station, but they couldn't afford to stop. Every second counted. "We need to find a place to lay low," Marcus whispered, his eyes scanning the dark trees ahead. "Somewhere they won't think to look." Harris nodded, his breathing labored but steady. "There's an old cabin about 2 miles from here," he said, pointing to a spot on the map. "It's off the grid. We should be safe there for a while." Marcus glanced at Harris, noting the pallor of his face and the way he favored his injured side. "You sure you can make it?" Harris managed a weak smile. "I don't have much of a choice, do I?" Marcus didn't respond. He knew Harris was right. They had to keep moving, no matter how exhausted or injured they were. The files they had stolen were their only hope of exposing Bradshaw and Daniels, and they couldn't risk losing them. They pressed on, the dense woods making their progress slow. Marcus kept his senses on high alert, his ears straining for any sounds of pursuit. So far, the night was quiet, but he knew that could change at any moment. After what felt like hours, they finally reached the cabin. A small, run-down structure hidden deep in the woods. The roof was sagging, and the windows were cracked, but it was shelter. Marcus pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of mildew. "Home sweet home," Harris muttered, sinking onto a dusty couch. Marcus set the files down on a rickety table and quickly checked the cabin's perimeter. The place was secure, at least for now. He returned to the main room, where Harris was already dozing off. "Get some rest," Marcus said, his voice low. "I'll keep watch." Harris didn't argue. He was asleep within minutes, his breathing shallow but steady. Marcus sat down at the table, the files spread out in front of him. He flipped through them, his heart racing as he read the contents. The files were damning. There were records of arrests that had been falsified, evidence that had been planted, and reports of excessive force that had been covered up. But the most incriminating documents were the ones that linked Bradshaw and Daniels to the drug ring Marcus had been investigating. Payments, coded messages, and even photographs of the officers meeting with known drug dealers. Marcus's hands trembled as he read through the files. This was it, the evidence they needed to bring Bradshaw and Daniels down. But he knew it wouldn't be easy. They were up against a system that had protected these corrupt officers for years. Exposing the truth would take more than just a few stolen files. As the hours passed, Marcus's mind raced with possibilities. They needed to get the evidence to someone who could help, someone with the power and influence to make sure it didn't get buried. But who could they trust? Then it hit him. Sarah, his court-appointed lawyer. She had been the only one who had believed in him from the beginning. If anyone could help them, it was her. Marcus pulled out his phone, checking for a signal. There was one bar, just enough to make a call. He dialed Sarah's number, his heart pounding as he waited for her to answer. "Hello?" Sarah's voice was groggy, but alert. "Sarah, it's Marcus," he said, keeping his voice low. "I need your help." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Marcus? Where are you? Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Marcus said quickly, "but I need you to listen carefully. I've got evidence, proof that Bradshaw and Daniels are corrupt, but I need your help to get it out." Sarah hesitated, then sighed. "Marcus, you're a fugitive. If I help you, I could lose my license, or worse." "I know," Marcus said, his voice firm, "but this is bigger than me. This is about exposing the truth, about making sure these guys can't hurt anyone else." There was another pause, longer this time. Finally, Sarah spoke. "Okay, what do you need me to do?" Marcus explained the plan quickly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Sarah listened carefully, asking a few questions but mostly staying silent. When he was finished, she let out a long breath. "This is risky," she said, "but I'll do it. Meet me at the old mill outside of town tomorrow night. I'll bring everything we need." Marcus nodded, relief washing over him. "Thank you, Sarah. I owe you one." "Just stay safe," Sarah said. "And Marcus, don't get caught." The line went dead, and Marcus slipped the phone back into his pocket. He glanced at Harris, who was still asleep on the couch. They had a plan. Now they just had to make it through the next 24 hours. The rest of the night passed slowly, the minutes dragging by as Marcus kept watch. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that danger was lurking just beyond the trees. But the cabin remained quiet, the only sound the occasional creak of the old wood. As dawn approached, Marcus finally allowed himself to rest, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. He knew the day ahead would be long and dangerous, but he also knew they were one step closer to exposing the truth. And when the truth finally came out, it would change everything. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale golden light over the woods as Marcus and Harris prepared to leave the cabin. Marcus had managed to get a few hours of restless sleep, but his mind was still racing. Today was the day. If everything went according to plan, they would meet Sarah at the old mill and finally expose the truth about Bradshaw and Daniels. Harris was looking better, his color returning and his movements less sluggish. He had changed the bandage on his wound, and though it still pained him, he was determined to keep going. "You sure you're up for this?" Marcus asked, slinging a bag of supplies over his shoulder. Harris nodded, his jaw set. "I'm not letting you do this alone. Besides, I've got a score to settle with those two." Marcus didn't argue. He knew Harris was as invested in this as he was. They had both been wronged by the system, and they were both ready to fight back. They set out through the woods, moving cautiously but quickly. The old mill was about 5 miles away, and they needed to get there before nightfall. Marcus kept his senses on high alert, his eyes scanning the trees for any signs of movement. The woods were quiet, but he knew that could change at any moment. As they walked, Marcus's mind kept returning to the files. The evidence they had stolen was damning, but it wouldn't mean anything if they couldn't get it into the right hands. Sarah was their best bet, but even she was taking a huge risk by helping them. Marcus couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt for dragging her into this, but he knew they didn't have a choice. This was bigger than all of them. After several hours of walking, they finally reached the edge of the woods. The old mill was just ahead, its weathered walls and broken windows standing as a testament to its age. The place had been abandoned for years, but it was the perfect spot for a meeting, secluded, but not too far from town. Marcus and Harris approached cautiously, their eyes scanning the area for any signs of trouble. The mill was quiet, the only sound the faint creak of the old windmill blades turning in the breeze. "She's not here yet," Harris said, his voice low. Marcus nodded. "We're early. Let's find a place to lay low until she arrives." They moved inside the mill, the air thick with dust and the smell of decay. Marcus found a spot near a window where he could keep an eye on the road, while Harris settled in nearby, his gun resting on his lap. The hours passed slowly, the tension in the air growing thicker with each passing minute. Marcus kept checking his phone, but there were no messages from Sarah. He tried to push down the worry gnawing at the edges of his mind. She would come. She had to. Finally, as the sun began to set, Marcus heard the sound of an engine in the distance. He peered out the window, his heart racing as a car came into view. It was Sarah. "She's here," Marcus said, relief washing over him. Harris stood, his expression grim. "Let's hope she's alone." They watched as Sarah parked the car and stepped out, her eyes scanning the area. She looked nervous, but determined. Marcus stepped out of the mill, raising a hand to signal her. "Over here," he called, keeping his voice low. Sarah hurried over, her eyes wide with relief. "Marcus," she said, her voice trembling. "I was so worried." "We're fine," Marcus said, though he knew they were far from it. "Did you bring what we talked about?" Sarah nodded, holding up a briefcase. "Everything's here, but we need to move quickly. The police are on high alert, and they're looking for you everywhere." Marcus took the briefcase, his hands trembling slightly. This was it. The evidence they needed to bring Bradshaw and Daniels down. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You don't know how much this means." Sarah shook her head. "Don't thank me yet. We still have a long way to go." Marcus nodded, his mind racing. They had the evidence, but they needed to get it to someone who could help, someone with the power to make sure it didn't get buried. But who could they trust? As if reading his mind, Sarah spoke up. "I've been in contact with a journalist," she said. "She's with a major news outlet, and she's willing to help us. But we need to meet her tonight." Marcus's eyes widened. "A journalist? Are you sure we can trust her?" Sarah nodded. "She's been investigating Bradshaw and Daniels for months. She's as invested in this as we are." Marcus exchanged a glance with Harris, who nodded. "It's our best shot," Harris said. Marcus took a deep breath, his mind made up. "Okay, let's do it." They moved quickly, loading the files into Sarah's car and climbing in. Sarah took the wheel, her hands steady despite the tension in the air. They drove in silence, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of the files in the back seat. As they approached the outskirts of town, Marcus's heart began to race. The streets were quiet, but he knew that could change at any moment. They were taking a huge risk, but it was one they had to take. Finally, they reached the meeting spot, a small, nondescript building on the edge of town. Sarah parked the car and turned to Marcus and Harris. "This is it," she said, her voice low. "Are you ready?" Marcus nodded, his jaw set. "Let's do this." They stepped out of the car, the files clutched tightly in Marcus's hands. The building was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of a neon sign above the door. They moved inside, their eyes scanning the dimly lit room. A woman stood near the back, her eyes narrowing as she saw them. She was tall and sharp-featured, with a no-nonsense expression that immediately put Marcus on edge. "You must be Marcus," she said, her voice cool and measured. Marcus nodded, his grip tightening on the files. "And you must be the journalist." The woman nodded. "I'm Rebecca. Sarah's told me a lot about you." Marcus didn't respond. He didn't have time for small talk. He handed her the files, his heart pounding as she began to flip through them. Rebecca's eyes widened as she read the contents, her expression growing more and more serious with each page. Finally, she looked up, her eyes meeting Marcus's. "This is explosive," she said, her voice filled with awe. "If this gets out, it'll blow the whole thing wide open." Marcus nodded, his jaw set. "That's the plan." Rebecca hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, I'll get this to my editor. We'll run the story tomorrow." Marcus felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. They still had to make it through the night. And with the police on high alert, that wouldn't be easy. As they left the building, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. They had done it. They had exposed the truth. But he also knew that the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The night was tense as Marcus, Harris, and Sarah waited for the story to break. They had taken refuge in a small, run-down motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where no one asked questions as long as you paid in cash. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and mildew. Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, his eyes glued to the small TV in the corner. The local news was on, but so far, there was no mention of Bradshaw and Daniels. "How long do you think it'll take?" Harris asked, pacing the room. His wound was still tender, but he was too restless to sit still. "Rebecca said the story would run tomorrow," Sarah replied, her voice calm but her eyes betraying her anxiety. "But we need to be ready for anything. If Bradshaw and Daniels catch wind of this before it goes public, they'll do everything in their power to stop it." Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. He knew Sarah was right. They were so close to exposing the truth, but the next few hours would be critical. One misstep, and everything could fall apart. The sound of a car engine outside made them all freeze. Marcus moved to the window, peering through the blinds. A black SUV was parked across the street, its engine idling. Two figures sat inside, their faces obscured by the tinted windows. "We've got company," Marcus said, his voice low. Harris grabbed his gun, his expression grim. "Who is it? Cops? Or the drug ring?" Marcus shook his head. "I don't know. But we can't take any chances. Sarah's eyes widened. What do we do? Marcus thought quickly. We need to split up. If they're after us, it'll be harder for them to track all of us separately. Harris nodded. I'll take the car and lead them away. You and Sarah stay here and lay low. Marcus hesitated. He didn't like the idea of splitting up, but he knew Harris was right. Be careful, he said, his voice firm. Harris smirked. Always am. He slipped out the back door, moving quickly and quietly. A few moments later, they heard the sound of an engine starting, followed by the screech of tires as Harris sped away. The black SUV followed, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Marcus let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. That should buy us some time. Sarah nodded, her face pale. What now? Marcus turned to her, his expression serious. We wait, and we hope Rebecca gets the story out before it's too late. The hours dragged by, each minute feeling like an eternity. Marcus kept the TV on, flipping between news channels, but there was still no mention of Bradshaw and Daniels. His nerves were frayed, his mind racing with possibilities. Had something gone wrong? Had Rebecca been compromised? Finally, as the first light of dawn began to creep through the blinds, the news anchor's voice cut through the silence. Breaking news this morning, the anchor said, her tone grave. Explosive allegations have surfaced against 2 local police officers, implicating them in a wide-ranging corruption scandal. Officers Bradshaw and Daniels are accused of falsifying evidence, accepting bribes, and even working with a known drug ring. The story, first reported by investigative journalist Rebecca Carter, has sent shockwaves through the community. Marcus felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. The anchor continued, her voice growing more urgent. In a related development, the 2 officers are now the subject of a manhunt after they allegedly fled their homes early this morning. Authorities are urging anyone with information to come forward. Sarah let out a breath, her hands trembling. It's out. The story's out. Marcus nodded, his heart pounding. They had done it. They had exposed the truth. But he also knew that the fight wasn't over. Bradshaw and Daniels were still out there, and they would stop at nothing to protect themselves. As if on cue, Marcus's phone buzzed. It was a text from Harris. They're on to me. Meet me at the old mill. Hurry. Marcus's stomach dropped. He showed the text to Sarah, his expression grim. We need to go. Now. They grabbed their things and slipped out of the motel, moving quickly and quietly. The streets were still mostly empty, the town just beginning to wake up. Marcus kept his hand on his gun, his senses on high alert. He knew they were walking into a trap, but he also knew he couldn't leave Harris behind. As they approached the old mill, Marcus's heart sank. The black SUV was parked outside, its doors open. Harris's car was there too, but there was no sign of him. Harris? Marcus called, his voice low. There was no response. The mill was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint creak of the windmill blades turning in the breeze. Marcus and Sarah moved inside, their eyes scanning the dimly lit room. The place was a mess. Overturned furniture, broken glass, and signs of a struggle. Harris, Marcus called again, his voice filled with desperation. This time, there was a response, a faint groan from the back of the mill. Marcus and Sarah hurried over, their hearts racing. Harris was lying on the floor, his face bruised and bloodied. He looked up at them, his eyes filled with pain but also determination. They got the jump on me, he said, his voice weak. But I took one of them down. The other. He's still here. Marcus's eyes widened. Where? Before Harris could respond, a voice cut through the silence. Right here. Marcus turned, his heart sinking as he saw Bradshaw standing in the doorway, his gun trained on them. His face was twisted with rage, his eyes filled with hatred. You think you can ruin me? Bradshaw snarled, his voice trembling with anger. You think you can take everything I've worked for? Marcus raised his hands, his mind racing. It's over, Bradshaw. The truth is out. There's nowhere for you to run. Bradshaw laughed, a cold, bitter sound. You're wrong. As long as I'm breathing, it's not over. He raised his gun, his finger tightening on the trigger. Marcus braced himself, his heart pounding. But before Bradshaw could fire, a shot rang out. Bradshaw's eyes widened in shock as he crumpled to the ground, a bullet hole in his chest. Marcus turned, his eyes wide with surprise. Harris was sitting up, his gun still smoking. He looked at Marcus, his expression grim. "Told you. I took one of them down," he said, his voice weak but filled with satisfaction. Marcus let out a breath, his knees going weak with relief. It was over. Bradshaw was dead, and Daniels was nowhere to be found. The truth had been exposed, and justice had been served. But as Marcus looked at Harris, his relief turned to concern. Harris's face was pale, his breathing shallow. He had lost a lot of blood, and he was fading fast. "We need to get you to a hospital," Marcus said, his voice filled with urgency. Harris shook his head, his eyes closing. "Too late for me." "But you did it, Marcus. You exposed the truth." Marcus felt a lump in his throat, his eyes filling with tears. "You did it too, Harris. We did it together." Harris smiled weakly, his hand reaching out to grip Marcus's. "Take care of yourself, brother." And with that, Harris's hand went limp, his eyes closing for the last time. Marcus sat there, his heart breaking as he held Harris's hand. They had won, but the cost had been high, too high. Sarah placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, her eyes filled with tears. "We need to go," she said softly, "before the police get here." Marcus nodded, his mind numb with grief. He stood, his legs trembling, and followed Sarah out of the mill. The sun was rising, casting a golden light over the town. But for Marcus, the world felt darker than ever. They had exposed the truth, but at what cost? The days that followed were a blur for Marcus. The story of Bradshaw and Daniels' corruption had exploded across the nation, dominating headlines and sparking outrage. The evidence Marcus and Harris had risked everything to obtain had done its job. Bradshaw was dead, and Daniels was now in custody, facing a mountain of charges. The drug ring they had been protecting was dismantled, its leaders arrested and its operations shut down. Justice had been served, but the victory felt hollow. Marcus stood at Harris's grave, the cool autumn wind tugging at his coat. The funeral had been small, attended only by a handful of people who had known Harris. Marcus had insisted on paying for everything, even though he barely had 2 dimes to rub together. Harris had been more than a partner. He had been a friend, a brother, and now he was gone. Sarah stood beside Marcus, her eyes red from crying. She had been a rock throughout the ordeal, but even she was struggling to hold it together. "He would have been proud of you," she said softly, placing a hand on Marcus's arm. "You did what you set out to do. You exposed the truth." Marcus nodded, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. The weight of everything that had happened was crushing him. He had set out to clear his name and bring down the corrupt officers who had framed him, but he hadn't expected it to cost so much. Harris's death was a wound that would never fully heal. As they turned to leave the cemetery, a car pulled up beside them. Marcus tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun. But when the door opened, it wasn't an enemy who stepped out. It was Rebecca, the journalist who had broken the story. "Marcus," she said, her voice filled with sympathy. "I'm so sorry about Harris. He was a hero." Marcus nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Rebecca hesitated, then held out a folder. "I thought you should see this. It's the final draft of the story. It's going to print tomorrow." Marcus took the folder, his hands trembling as he flipped through the pages. The story was thorough, detailing everything from Bradshaw and Daniels' corruption to the drug ring they had been protecting. But what caught Marcus's eye was the last paragraph. A tribute to Harris, calling him a hero who had sacrificed everything to expose the truth. Marcus closed the folder, his eyes filling with tears. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca nodded, her expression serious. "There's something else. Daniels is talking. He's trying to cut a deal, but he's giving up names, big names. This thing goes higher than we thought. There are politicians, judges, even other cops involved. This is just the beginning." Marcus felt a surge of anger, but it was quickly replaced by exhaustion. He was tired, so tired. He had fought so hard, lost so much, and now it seemed like the fight was never going to end. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with concern. Rebecca sighed. Now, we keep fighting. We make sure everyone involved faces justice. But we can't do it without you, Marcus. You're the one who started this. You're the one who exposed the truth. Marcus shook his head, his heart heavy. I can't. Not anymore. I've lost too much. Rebecca and Sarah exchanged a glance, but neither of them pushed him. They knew what he had been through. They knew the cost. As they drove back to town, Marcus's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He had set out to clear his name, to expose the truth, and he had done that. But at what cost? Harris was gone, and Marcus's life would never be the same. He had no home, no job, no future. All he had was the truth, and the knowledge that he had done the right thing. That night, Marcus sat alone in a cheap motel room, the folder Rebecca had given him resting on the table. He flipped through the pages again, his eyes lingering on the tribute to Harris. He thought about everything they had been through, everything they had sacrificed, and he realized something. Harris wouldn't have wanted him to give up. Harris had believed in the fight, even when it seemed hopeless. And now, it was up to Marcus to carry on that fight. The next morning, Marcus met with Rebecca and Sarah at a small cafe on the edge of town. They were both surprised to see him, but he cut straight to the point. "I'm in," he said, his voice firm. "But on one condition, we do this my way. No more unnecessary risks. No more casualties. We expose the truth, but we do it smart." Rebecca and Sarah exchanged a glance, then nodded. "We're with you," Sarah said, her voice filled with determination. And so, the fight continued. Over the next few months, Marcus, Rebecca, and Sarah worked tirelessly to expose the corruption that had infected their town. They uncovered more names, more crimes, more lies. And one by one, the people responsible were brought to justice. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, close calls, and moments when it all seemed hopeless. But Marcus never gave up. He couldn't. Not after everything he had been through. Not after everything he had lost. In the end, the truth prevailed. The corrupt politicians, judges, and cops were arrested, their crimes exposed for the world to see. The town began to heal, and the people who had been wronged finally got the justice they deserved. But for Marcus, the fight was never really over. He knew there would always be more corruption, more lies, more injustice. But he also knew that as long as there were people willing to fight for the truth, there was hope. As he stood at Harris's grave one last time, Marcus felt a sense of peace. He had done what he set out to do. He had exposed the truth, and he knew that Harris would be proud. "We did it, brother," Marcus said, his voice filled with emotion. "We exposed the truth, and we'll keep fighting. For you. For everyone." And with that, Marcus turned and walked away, ready to face whatever came next. The fight for truth and justice is never easy, and the cost can be unimaginably high. But remember, every step you take toward exposing lies and standing up for what's right is a step toward a better world. Even when the road is dark and the odds seem impossible, your courage and determination can light the way. You may lose battles, and you may lose people you love, but the truth you uncover and the change you create will echo far beyond your own life. Keep fighting, not just for yourself, but for those who can't. Your bravery matters, and your story isn't over yet. Stay strong, and never stop believing in the power of truth. This concludes the story of a white cop that framed a black man, unaware he's a CIA agent. Feel free to share your thoughts and opinions about this shocking story in the comments section below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to get notified whenever there's a new video. It will help us bring you more impactful content. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.